my lovely A&P 1 students. This is going to be the intro lab video for our brain anatomy lab. So what I want to do is just go over a couple things with the lab and then give you a brief overview of how I think it's easiest to learn the anatomy of the brain. So here we go. You'll see your lab objective sheet. And on this, you'll see the structures of the brain that you need to know. And if we look at the structures of the brain, they're separated by external structures and internal structures. Anything that is crossed off, you don't need to know. And you might be surprised, there's quite a few things that you don't need to know for this lab. And the main reason is because they're really hard to see. So unfortunately, it's not that I'm trying to have you know less, because a lot of these structures are really important, but it's just that they're really hard to see. So I don't feel comfortable asking you something that's really hard to see. So if it's crossed off, you don't need to know it. But not to worry, there's still plenty of structures that you do need to know. All right. So I'm going to post on Blackboard some pictures of the human brain. Actually, let me get rid of that. There we go. So you'll see some pictures of the human brain, and you'll also you'll see them labeled and unlabeled. And then in the lab objective sheet, you will see a YouTube link for the sheep brain dissection. So make sure you watch that, because you are going to be asked to be able to label these structures on human models and on the sheep brain. So make sure that you watch this. Okay, so let me start off by telling you the 4 parts of the brain that these are organized by. So you can see I've listed 3 here, cerebrum, brainstem, diencephalon, and the 4th part would be the cerebellum. So I find it helpful to organize this by 4 parts. So let's just start there. Let's say that we're going to separate the brain into 4 regions. And I think this is a good place to start. So we're going to have the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the brainstem. So my suggestion, if I can say it right, is to start here, all right? So the cerebrum is the biggest part of the brain. What I'm putting in red here is the cerebrum, okay? It's the wormy part, and it's what you think of as the brain. What we know, this is the only part of the brain that includes functions that are voluntary. Our new kitten that we rescued from outside, Oscar, is running around here. All right. So this is the only part of the brain that has functions that are voluntary. Not all parts of it are voluntary, but almost all parts of it are voluntary. Then we have the cerebellum. The cerebellum is this back part, kind of looks like a cauliflower, or in real life kind of looks like ground beef, if you look at this part back here. So the cerebellum is what is in blue. The brainstem, as the name suggests, is the stem of the brain. So if this were a lollipop, the brainstem would be the stick that holds the lollipop. Which leaves last, let's see, what color can I use? Maybe I'll use white. The last part is this middle section that we call the dot. Actually, let me fix that so I can be completely accurate. We don't want to make any mistakes here. I would say right here is the diencephalon. So it's kind of in the middle, and I've put it in white. I know if I put white there on white, you're not going to be able to see it. So I would start there, all right? Then, once we know that, we can start to dig in more deeply. So let me go back here, and let's start with the external structures. Probably easiest, let me go back to that list for a second. Yeah. Okay, now that we've done that, I'm gonna erase this. And the kitten is running around like crazy. It's okay. So, on the cerebral cortex, we have these depressions called sulci. And the way that I remember it as sulci is that if you're depressed, you may sulk. And on the other hand, we have these elevations. And these elevations are called gyri. And the idea is that this gives the cerebral cortex, or the outer part of the cerebrum, more surface area, right? And if there's more surface area, because it goes up and down and up and down, and each up is a gyrus and each down is a sulcus. The idea is if we have more surface area, then the brain can do more of its job. Really beneficial there. All right. Let's talk about the longitudinal fissure. If we look at the cerebrum, it has two halves, right? So we have one half of the cerebrum, the other half of the cerebrum, or the fancy word is hemisphere. We have two hemispheres. The fissure that runs down the middle is called the longitudinal fissure. That's a really bad label, but you get my point. All right. So the big fissure running down the middle of the two cerebral hemispheres is called the longitudinal fissure. Let's look at the brainstem. Let's look at the brainstem in this view, okay? If you look at the brainstem, let's just do it in order. The most inferior part of the brainstem is called the medulla, or medulla oblongata. Either one is okay for me. The pons is in the middle. And when you look at the sheep brain dissection video, it's actually a little bit harder to see in real life. The one giveaway that I look for the pons is that it's a little bit more bulbous. Okay, so if you look for that little round bulbous part, you know it's the pons, which leaves this area up here to be the midbrain. So if we do it from superior to inferior, from top to bottom, midbrain, pons, medulla. Check, check, check. Hopefully that's how you're going to feel when you get to the practical. Now, these are the lobes that you already know because it's the same names as we had for the bones. So remember the parts of the skull? If I can find it, there we go. If we recall the parts of the skull, we had different bones of the skull, frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. Well, similarly named are the lobes or regions of the cerebral cortex. So frontal region, the cerebral cortex, parietal region, occipitals in the back, and then temporal would be by the ear. Same names as the bones. That shouldn't be that difficult for you. We're also going to be asking you to know some of the cranial nerves. The olfactory nerve is Roman numeral cranial nerve number 1. The optic nerve is Roman numeral cranial nerve number 2. And the best picture to look at that would be this one. And you can even see on this model they're labeled. So if you look carefully, there's a Roman numeral 1, and here's a Roman numeral 2. So indeed, this here is the olfactory nerve and the olfactory bulb. Technically, the bulb is more of the part here towards the top, and the tract is more of this part. But we're going to just call it together. So we're going to call this the olfactory bulb and tract. This is, of course, the cranial nerve that's going to go to our nose and allow us to smell. In the sheep brain dissection, you'll see that the olfactory bulbs or the tips are bigger than in human brains. That's because sheep, like many other animals, rely more on smell. Of course. Number 2 here would be the optic nerve. So this here is the beginning of one optic nerve, and this here is the beginning of the other optic nerve. As the name suggests, these go to our eyeballs. And then we can see here where the optic nerves come together. So we have one optic nerve going to the right eyeball, the other optic nerve going to the left eyeball. But we, of course, want to have that information coming together so we form one visual image. So where the optic nerves come together, where I'm circling in this pinkish color, where the optic nerves come together is called the optic chiasm. You may also see it called optic chiasma, either one. All right, good stuff. And then lastly, of course, is the cerebellum, which is right here. Here's what it kind of looks like ground beef, cerebellum. All right, I didn't cover the meninges. I'm going to let you review those on your own. I know you talked about it in lecture. Dura mater is the outermost cover of the brain, and you'll see this in the sheep brain dissection video. The arachnoid is the middle covering, and the pia is the innermost covering. These are the coverings of the brain. And actually, they do cover the spinal cord too. All right, let's look at the internal structures. So if we look here, we can see the cerebrum, and we're going to talk about the outer cortex, which is made up of white matter. I'm sorry for going back and forth. I couldn't think of a better way to do it. So if you're getting a little sick, I apologize. Just don't have beers before you study. Ah, that was a joke. All right, so I'm going to erase all this stuff. And let's talk about the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is this whole region, but as a matter of fact, just the outer part we call the cerebral cortex. So just the outer rim is the cerebral cortex. Cortex means outer. We're going to see this a lot as we continue to go through the body systems. We're going to talk about the adrenal cortex, which is the outer rim of the adrenal gland. We're going to talk about the renal cortex, which is the outer rim of the kidneys. So cortex just means outer. In this case, it's the cerebral cortex, and this is going to be made up of white matter. Oh, I'm sorry, gray matter. Maybe I had some beers before I recorded this lecture. No, I didn't. If I was going to drink, it'd be wine, but not yet, because I am dedicated to you. So in the sheep brain video dissection, you'll see he cuts kind of a frontal cut, and you'll see that the cerebral cortex is gray matter versus the rest of the cerebrum is white matter. Okay, so know that difference. The cerebral cortex is the outer rim of the cerebrum, and it is made up of gray matter, whereas the remaining portions of the cerebrum are made up of white matter. All right, good stuff. Let's talk about the corpus callosum and the fornix. This structure right here is called the corpus callosum. And I actually like what the dude in the video says. He says it kind of reminds him of an upside down Nike swoosh, which I can see. And then the floor to that fornix, let's go with blue, is called the fornix. So this structure right here is called the fornix. And the way that I remember it is it's more or less the floor to the corpus callosum. So I just think FF, floor, fornix. The corpus callosum is the area of the, right below the cerebrum, kind of part of the cerebrum, The corpus callosum is what's responsible for allowing information to be transferred between each cerebral hemisphere. So we absolutely want the right hemisphere of the cerebrum to be able to communicate with the left cerebral hemisphere. And the area that allows the two cerebral hemispheres to communicate is the corpus callosum. All right, let's talk about the diencephalon. And this can be a little bit tricky. So I'm going to erase this. And let's see if we can talk about the diencephalon. So we know that's kind of the middle area, diencephalon. And let's start with what I'm coloring in blue right here. This is the thalamus. If we were meeting in the lab and we had these models with us, I would probably tell you that it looks like a boob, kind of an oval boob, but a boob nonetheless, because it's a little bit elevated, it's a little bit rounded, convex, and it has a nipple on it. So in the more or less the center of the diencephalon region, we have the thalamus. A little bit anterior and inferior from the thalamus is a region known as the hypothalamus. And actually, I want to fix that because I'm going to label something else there in a minute. Let me do this smartly. You probably can't read that very well. Hypothalamus. And you know what's kind of weird is that in the sheep brain, it really just all looks like mush. So it's amazing that these central regions of the brain do so much for us, but they do. Hanging down from the hypothalamus is going to be the pituitary gland. These models we have in the lab are missing them because they weren't attached that well when the plastic models were made. It does kind of look like a testicle, but it's not. Although it does release hormones that go to the testicle. How about that? But you should know, hanging down from the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. All right. And then lastly, we're going to have a region in the diencephalon called the epithalamus. So what I'm coloring in here in black is the epithalamus. And I encourage you to make a reference point in the center with the thalamus. So if you look at that oval area with the nipple, the boob, the thalamus is in the middle. And if you use that as your reference, then you know a little bit below it is the hypothalamus, and a little bit behind the thalamus is the epithalamus. Hard to see on this model, but I want you to know that the epithalamus contains the pineal gland. Some may say pineal, I say pineal. As you're going to learn in lecture, or maybe you already have, this is the gland that secretes melatonin, which is one of our hormones that we know is responsible for our sleep-wake cycle. All right, my friends, there we go. Last thing to cover is going to be the cerebellum. Let's do it. So the cerebellum, the whole thing is right here, right? That's the cerebellum. But let's just be a little bit more specific, and I'm going to erase these structures now. You have access to labeled pictures on Blackboard. So the whole organ is the cerebellum. The inner pattern of white matter. So if you look here, we have an inner pattern of white matter, kind of looks like tree branches. That inner pattern of white matter is called the arbor vitae, and that's where it gets its name. Arbor means tree, vitae means life in Latin, so that inner tree-like pattern of white matter is called the arbor vitae. And the last structure is the vermis. So here we have an inferior view of the brain, and where these two cerebellar hemispheres connect is called the vermis. Kind of hard to see in these pictures, but when we put the two halves of the brain together, the two cerebellar hemispheres meet at these structures called the vermis. So collectively, where the two halves of the cerebrum, let me say that again, where the two halves of the cerebellum come together is called the vermis. All right, good stuff, folks. The last thing here in the lab for you to go over would be the cranial nerves. I've listed them. They're in a table, which didn't show up on the formatting when I brought it over here to my iPad so I could write on it, but it's on a prettier table in your lab. I've started the only ones that you need to know. I'd like you to know the olfactory nerve, optic nerve, which we both labeled in this video. And then I also want to point out the 10th cranial nerve, which is the vagus. I listed them here just because I think it's good for you to have a copy of that list. At some point, you may be asked to memorize them, and there's all sorts of sayings to memorize them. On Old Olympus, top something or other, or there's like a dirty one. I first had this class, A&P, probably 20 years ago, and the stupid saying that I remembered, oh, to touch and feel, very green vegetables say hi. So stupid, right? But 20 years later, I remembered olfactory, optic, oculomotor, and I'm not reading it from the screen, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, and so forth. But for now, just know olfactory, cranial nerve number 1 goes to the nose, optic, cranial nerve number 2 goes to the eyeballs, and then vagus is our 10th cranial nerve, and it has branches that really go, bad drawing up ahead, watch out. The cranial nerve has branches that go all through our gut. So the vagus nerve has branches that innervate or supply pretty much every organ in your thoracic cavity and your abdominal cavity and your pelvic cavity. And you should know that when stimulated, these branches have a parasympathetic effect, right? Which means rest and digest. So this will decrease heart rate and blood pressure, but any parasympathetic nerve activity will increase GI tract activity. It will increase renal activity. So the branches of our vagus nerve are our main parasympathetic nerves. And then lastly, in this column, we can see whether each cranial nerve is sensory, motor, or both. You don't need to know those for my lab. Again, you may need to know them later. The common saying to memorize those would be, some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter most. Or some people will say, some say marry money, but my brother says big boobs matter most. Depends who your brother is, but just for later, in case you need to memorize those, but not for this lab. And then you'll see some questions for you for your lab assignment, but that's all I have. Good luck, everyone.